as co-host.
Slides look good on my end, Ken.
Okay. We'll give it a few more minutes, but I think in the meantime, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. While we're waiting, we can get some introductions started with our Department of Energy Building Performance Standards team. And also, if you're an invited committee member, please do drop your name and affiliation into the chat for us. Blake, you want to lead it off?
Sure, thanks, Ken. I think I know most of the folks that are probably on the call, but I'm Blake Shalide. I'm the manager of the Codes and Standards section at the Oregon Department of Energy. And I'll kick it over to Judy.
I am Judy, and I am the public service representative for the Codes and Standards team. Kick it over to Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm the Planning and Innovation Executive Assistant.
And I am Ken Davies, Program Analyst with the Building Performance Standards team. Just a quick reminder there on how to use WebEx for the meeting. And a reminder of who we are at the Oregon Department of Energy. We do expect you'll have some questions today, so as they occur, please enter them into the chat, and we will go through them one by one once we get through this short presentation. Although we have met with some of you before, we're considering this the first convening of the Tier 2 Building Owners Advisory Committee on the potential implementation of a building performance standard for Tier 2 buildings. We'll get into the how and why of that momentarily, as well as the timeline for this effort. As many of you are already aware, in December of 2024, the Oregon Department of Energy adopted rules specifying a building performance standard, or BPS, as directed by House Bill 3409. That was passed in 2023. The standards became effective on January 1st of this year, 2025, and compliance will be required at the earliest by 2028. Although covered building owners may need to take action now to ensure they are prepared to demonstrate that compliance. In brief, there are now energy performance standards for Tier 1 covered buildings larger than 35,000 square feet. Those standards include setting of energy use intensity targets based on the building activity type and provide a variety of different compliance pathways. Just another reminder here on the tiered structure of the standard. Covered buildings are subdivided into two groups, Tier 1 and Tier 2, Tier 1 being the orange and Tier 2 the green. The compliance dates are based on square footage, with larger buildings going first, and on the Tier 1 or Tier 2 status. So why are we here? We're here because of the directives in the language of HB 3409, which state that no later than July 1st of this year, the department shall establish and consult an advisory committee to identify and evaluate the financial and non-financial implications of establishing and implementing an energy performance standard for Tier 2 buildings. As you can see on the slide, we've got a pretty long on-ramp here, almost 5 years, until this group is due to deliver a recommendation to the governor's office. Key dates in the overall BPS timeline, and then at the end they're that October 2030 date that I just mentioned for Tier 2 BPS recommendation. So what is this process going to look like for the Department of Energy? And just we're at the very beginning, really. We still need to start gathering Tier 1 data, as well as the Tier 2 benchmarking data, other data that becomes available as the program moves forward. And then a question for the group: how often should we meet after the Tier 2 benchmarking date has been reached? Given the approximate 5-year timeline and that Tier 1 data is not even coming in yet, we're suggesting a meeting frequency of twice a year, but wanted to get your thoughts on that. So if you do have some thoughts on that, please put them into the chat for us. Back once more to the legislation and directive for this group. We'll send out a poll to the committee members after the meeting at some point, and really that is just to see if you've got any early thoughts on financial or non-financial implications. Some of the issues listed there, like equity, energy measures and retrofit costs, audit costs, etc., so that we can help identify what the top priorities for you are. We do have some resources that we can apply towards developing better info on those topics once we've established those priorities. And we'd also welcome any data from members of the committee that would like to share that and help inform our eventual decision. We'll start going through the questions in the chat now. So if you have any additional ones on this topic, please feel to drop them in there.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat yet, but I'll just take this moment to kind of reinforce that it is a pretty long, long lead time. We've got about 5 years between now and when we need to make the recommendation to the governor and to the legislature about a performance standard for Tier 2 buildings. And at that time, it would just be a recommendation that we make. It wouldn't be agency rulemaking that we do. We don't have that ability or that authority. It would really just be a recommendation that would then require subsequent legislative direction or executive direction for us to go forward and do something with that recommendation. So, what exactly the end product and the output and that recommendation looks like, I think there's still a whole lot of shaping that needs to be done between now and then. And that's where we're really looking for the input and guidance and consultation from this advisory committee in terms of helping us prioritize what some of those implications are and where we can potentially have data and other sources and information to help inform how we shape those recommendations. So definitely kind of open to any and all thoughts at this pretty early stage here, as we start to look and develop a potential recommendation for a standard for Tier 2 buildings. I'm starting to see some questions come in the chat and some comments. I see a comment from Clark regarding meeting frequency, a recommendation to consider meeting quarterly for the first 1 to 2 years, and then transition to biannually after the program rollout is more mature. So thanks for that. The next question from Vinny is the advisory committee accepting new members to sit and provide input on the committee? We established the committee last year as part of our rulemaking when we were going through the Tier 1 and Tier 2. We had kind of an open call for committee members at that time, and pretty much anybody who raised their hand, we welcomed onto the committee. I forget exactly how many are on now. It's at least I think a couple dozen that are on the advisory committee. I don't think we're looking for any new members at this time, but all of the advisory committee meetings will continue to be open to the public, and for public participation and input. And you can certainly feel free to attend and to weigh in through that, measure that way. So it looks like Clark had just another follow-up question, or just a comment. The first 1 to 2 years will be when the rubber will meet the road. Yeah, I think we agree there. Yeah. A comment from Michael that recognizing that tier 1 data is still being received, maybe after the first deadline, we can meet more often. Yeah, I think that does kind of make sense. There's, we won't have a whole lot of actual building data to work with until that first round of tier 1 buildings and then the tier 2 buildings report in 2028. So I think kind of ramping up committee activity between then and when the recommendations are due makes a lot of sense. So. And then Kathleen has another comment, or that the assumption work would ramp up after we've seen more data come in. Yeah, and I think that's kind of confirming the same. Increasing frequency later might be helpful, and I think that probably makes sense too, after we start to get more data and have actual information to analyze. There's a question from Mitch that's a little bit more specific, not necessarily about this committee. It sounds like about if a building's being demolished near the time of compliance, would it be necessary to benchmark the building? I think we might just put a pin in that one, and Mitch, we can respond to that separately, but we'll try to keep all of the kind of discussion here related to the advisory committee and recommendations for the tier 2 work. And Ken, feel free to weigh in or kind of read these questions too. Definitely,
Yeah.
I don't
No
need
problem.
to take it all too, but
One here from Kaylee Sheehan. If we will have advisory subcommittees by specialty or facility type, maybe by building activity type. In Washington, it sounds like there was a focus for healthcare specific facilities due to unique requirements.
yeah, I mean, I think our eventual recommendation for a performance standard for tier 2 buildings might result in a different recommendation for the different tier 2 building types. So like just to kind of revisit the types, tier 2 building types include multifamily, hospitals, universities, schools, and dormitories. So, I think that we could envision a different recommendation for hospitals as compared to schools, as compared to multifamily. I don't think we know yet whether or not we'll approach that in a subcommittee approach or just full committee meetings that include specific targeted discussion of each one of those sectors. But I think we're open to having some individual like subsector meetings if that's kind of how this advisory committee wants to approach it. Yeah, see a raised hand from Adam.
Hi, I had a question. I guess what kind of recommendations are you envisioning this committee putting together? 'Cause if I remember from a previous presentation, there's already performance standards that were established or EUIs. Is this looking at adjusting those numbers in the future, or specifically about assigning financial penalties for non-compliance?
Yeah, Ken, I don't know if you have any input. I can.
No, go ahead, Blake.
Start out, yeah. So I think we don't necessarily have, I think, any really kind of preconceived notions about what sort of standards we might be. I mean, I think there's a kind of a spectrum or a continuum of what we might what could be a potential recommendation. It could go as far as, yeah, setting new targets for individual tier 2 buildings, because you're right. As part of the initial effort, we did set targets for buildings that include the tier 2 building types, even though tier 2 buildings don't need to yet meet those. So I think after we gather more data, it could be a reevaluation of what those targets are. It could be looking at what some of the other compliance requirements are for, what are tier 1 buildings now. We're developing like energy management plans, looking at like O&M programs, maybe other alternative compliance pathways for tier 2 buildings. I think it kind of runs the spectrum of looking at all of the potential options for what a performance standards mean. That doesn't necessarily need to be the exact same as just saying, yeah, we think all tier 2 buildings should also do what tier 1 buildings are required to do now. But it could vary. It could include elements of it. It could include, other things that aren't included now for tier 1. But I think that's where we're hoping to get some more information.
Was there another hand up? Yeah. Okay.
I don't see any.
Got one from Ven.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering if the tier 2 buildings can start benchmarking with Portfolio Manager now, or like in the next month, particularly considering the early incentives. And is that data that this committee would also be evaluating early on based on the initial kind of early benchmarking adopters?
Yeah, I think as soon as you'd like to do that, that certainly helps prepare you in terms of your own buildings. And if that's data that you're willing to share with the committee, then I think that helps inform future decisions as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the amount of data that we get reported early to us through the incentive programs will probably be relatively small in terms of number of buildings compared to the number of buildings that will need to report by 2028. But as we do start getting those early reporters in, I think that is data that we could work with the committee on to analyze.
Not seeing anything else, Blake.
No, me neither. I guess we don't want to take up any more time than we need to. I know this presentation was pretty short and brief, just kind of providing a general overview, but I think we've got a couple key pieces of feedback here for how to approach some of the meeting frequency pieces and kind of our overall timeline. And as Ken mentioned, we'll send out a brief survey to help us prioritize what some of those other considerations, the financial and non-financial implications might be, and definitely want to look to the committee's input to help us rank and prioritize those as we move forward with this work. And we don't want to, like I said, take up any more of the committee's time here than we need to, but we can certainly stay on a little bit longer if folks do have any more particular questions or want to chat about anything. I'll just thank folks for your willingness to help us with this work.
Yeah, for sure. And otherwise, we'll reward you with 40 minutes of your afternoon back. Oh, here's one. I think Blake, you're up to speed on the portfolio manager situation.
Yeah.
Just asking how
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I see it. Let's see, there's a question from Rachel about if there's an insight from this group into the future fate of Energy Star Portfolio Manager, given the potential for the Energy Star program to go away, and will Portfolio Manager likely continue to be the reporting platform used for Oregon's benchmarking program? I'm really curious if there's anyone else on the call who has any particular insights. I'll just say to start that we have been closely tracking this situation. Energy Star Portfolio Manager is deeply integrated into our program, into our rules as the reporting framework and the reporting system for energy usage. And if it were to go away, then we would have to pivot and have another solution. As we understand it in talking to our colleagues at US EPA and others in the industry that are kind of working pretty closely on this, there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of where it might live, and there's still the potential that it'll continue in its current form that's supported by the federal government at some level, whether that's EPA, DOE, national labs, or some combination of all of those, which I think would be our hopeful and optimistic and preferred outcome, is that it's still a tool that we can utilize and reference that's hosted and supported at the federal level. In the absence of that, I think there's a few other alternatives where maybe it's hosted by private organizations and becomes just a separately administered program that we could still use. But there's always the potential that we might need to pivot and just have a different system. But for right now, we're still leaning on Energy Star. And as soon as we know more is when we'll share that and make the necessary adjustments.
And then I think Michael has his hand up.
Yeah, just going along with that, like, is there language in the rulemaking legislation that we can change to a different format? And then also, I know I'm working with 2 other groups that are developing some type of benchmarking program that is better and easier than Energy Star. So I know that there's other options out there.
Yeah, that's helpful. To your first question, I think it would be a change that we would be able to and need to make within our administrative rulemaking and the standard itself. There's no particular requirements in the legislation that require us to use Portfolio Manager. We've included that in our standard. But and then maybe to your second point, yeah, that's something that we expect, and if Energy Star goes away, that there would be other private service providers that would gather together and offer a similar functionality, maybe more functional than Energy Star that could be referenced, because it certainly fills a need in the industry. Energy Portfolio Manager, I think, has had a great, it's got great brand recognition, and it certainly fills a gap in there that would be a big hole if it were to go away, and I'm sure somebody would race to fill it.
Not seeing any other hands or questions in the chat. So then if there, oh, here we go. Mitch, for tier 2 buildings, have the early incentives proposal details been discussed with the committee, restrictions, etc., and or finalized?
Yeah, thanks, Mitch, for the question. We had last month a meeting where we invited both the original rulemaking advisory committee for BPS and then also the tier 2 advisory committee for input on our draft early incentive rules for the state portion, the $2 million of early incentive funding. And then after that meeting, we published our draft rules that are right now open for public comment. So they're not finalized yet, and we would certainly welcome any public comment that you have on those draft rules. Maybe we can get a link in the chat to where those are located. And that process closes in early July. We have a public comment hearing scheduled for July 1st. And I believe the official public comment window closes on either July 2nd or July 3rd after the public comment hearing. Yeah, thanks, Judy. There's a link to our rulemaking page.
That link is in the chat there. If anybody needs to copy that, and we can kind of hang out here if people need to access that for a few more minutes. Blake, thoughts on meeting again next? You want to, I guess we'd have more to report towards the beginning of the year regarding portal and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, maybe I'll kind of turn that back around too to the folks that are still on. Like, if there's a thought, I know it was kind of mentioned before to meet quarterly. We're certainly happy to schedule something for the third quarter of the year. And if there's any like suggested things to cover in those meetings, definitely interested in hearing that feedback. But yeah, so after the first of the year, we'll definitely have some updates on the compliance management system, the software that we'll use for actually documenting compliance. We'll start to get a lot more information on like actual covered buildings and the inventory list that we're building out. We didn't mention it earlier, but we'll be sending mailer notifications to building owners here very soon. And part of that will be receiving feedback from those building owners, hopefully on more information on their covered buildings. So that's something that we could potentially, and that includes tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. So that's something that we could potentially talk about too.
Hearing a loose consensus on January then.
Thumbs up from Adam.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, we will let you get back to your afternoon. And thanks again for everybody that showed up today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Look forward
Thank you.
to future collaboration.